The next chromosomal disorder that we will be studying about is Klinefelter syndrome. Klinefelter syndrome is also known as 47XXY or just XXY syndrome. Now it is a disease that specifically affects males. It affects males only, females are not affected, and it manifests itself when there are 2 or more X chromosomes found in the male. So a male is made up of 1 X chromosome and 1 Y chromosome. So this is normally what is found in males, 1 X and 1 Y chromosome. But if there are more than 2, so if there is 2 or more than 2, then that person, that male, will be suffering from Klinefelter syndrome. Now Klinefelter syndrome has all of these symptoms, which would be sterility, small testicles, weaker muscle, greater height, poor coordination, less body hair, breast growth, and a decreased interest in sex. They also important thing about Klinefelter syndrome, unlike Down's and Turner syndrome, is that Klinefelter syndrome shows its symptoms only when the male hits puberty. So only when the male hits puberty the symptoms are noticed. Until then the child, when it is growing before puberty, does not necessarily show any of these symptoms. It's only when the child hits puberty that these symptoms are known and they become shown. Intelligence in people suffering, in males suffering from Klinefelter syndrome, it's usually normal, so there is no decrease in intelligence level as compared to Down syndrome, but they do have reading and speech difficulty. Another thing with Klinefelter syndrome is that the normal chromosome content for a male should be X and Y. If there is 1 extra X chromosome, that leads to Klinefelter syndrome. But if you keep adding more X chromosomes to the male, then all of these symptoms become heightened. So the severity of the symptoms become more and more with the addition of each X chromosome. So 1 X chromosome added, you have Klinefelter syndrome with all of these symptoms. Another extra chromosome added, you will have all of these symptoms but with a increased severity. So the severity of these symptoms will be increased. Another X chromosome added, the severity is even more increased. So Klinefelter syndrome is somehow quantitative in a sense based on the number of X chromosomes that are there. Okay. Now Klinefelter syndrome, like any other chromosomal abnormality that is found like Down syndrome or Turner syndrome, can be figured out by doing a karyotyping. Karyotyping is when you do a cytological study on any eukaryotic cell, specifically when it is in its division state, so that you can visualize the chromosomes. So in humans you need to have 44 autosomes plus 2 allosomes. So that is how you normally find them, and they are 22 pairs of chromosomes, meaning that you will have 2 of each. So chromosome 1 you will find 2, chromosome 2 you will find 2, and same goes until 22 chromosomes, and then you will have 1 X and 1 Y chromosome. So the visualization of chromosomes under the microscope is called as karyotyping. So just by doing karyotyping, you will be able to figure out if the person has the normal number of chromosomes that need to be there, and if the chromosomes are in the shape that they need to be in, meaning that they have not lost a part of the chromosome like we would see in, say, Cri-du-Chat syndrome, wherein the 5th chromosome's short arm, the terminal end is lost. So these kind of things can be seen by observing the chromosomes, all of the chromosomes, in one single eukaryotic cell under the microscope, and that study is called as karyotyping. So any sort of chromosomal abnormality can be figured out through a variety of things. You can do a lot of physiological studies, but the basic one would be karyotyping. The next chromosomal disorder that we will be talking about is Turner syndrome. Turner syndrome is also known as 45X syndrome or XO syndrome. It was discovered, or rather described, by Henry Turner in the year 1938. It is a symptom or a syndrome that specifically affects females. So Klinefelter syndrome is something that specifically affects males, and Turner syndrome is something that specifically affects females, because both of them are sex-linked in a sense that the syndrome is manifesting itself because there is an abnormality in the sex chromosome specifically, as opposed to Down syndrome, which is an autosomal disorder, so it can affect either males or females. Now, in females, it can be that there is one entire X chromosome that is completely missing, or a part of one of the X chromosomes is missing. Something like in Cri du Chat syndrome, where in the 5th chromosome, short arm, a part of the chromosome is missing. So in the same way, in the X chromosome, in one of the X chromosomes, if a part of the chromosome is missing, or the entirety of the X chromosome is missing, then that female will be suffering from Turner syndrome. Turner syndrome will have symptoms such as short webbed neck, low set ears, low hairline, specifically in the back of the neck, short stature, they are not that tall, they have swollen hands and feet, heart defects, diabetes, and they will have a low level of thyroid hormone. Now, unlike Klinefelter syndrome, Turner syndrome, all of the symptoms are pretty much seen at birth. Specifically until here, the swollen hands and feet is something that is very evident even at birth. So once the baby is born, you can figure out based on whether or not the baby has swollen hands and feet that the baby, the female, would be having Turner's syndrome. Now, because they have a low thyroid hormone level, they usually are infertile and they are unable to have children unless until they undergo hormone treatment. So they do not go through the menstrual cycle. So when the female hits puberty, she is not going to go through the menstrual cycle unless and until the female is given hormone treatment. Also, when the female grows to be of a certain age and wants to have children, they cannot unless and until they undergo some sort of reproductive techniques. So without some sort of external intervention, these females cannot be fertile and they cannot have children. And like in Down syndrome or in Klinefelter syndrome, Turner syndrome can also be detected by various methods, but the major one that is used is karyotyping, wherein you are going to figure out how the chromosomes look under the microscope, and based on that you can also calculate, or rather pick out how many chromosomes are there for that individual in each individual cell. So the next topic that we'll be talking about is pedigree analysis. Pedigree analysis is specifically a tool that is used by geneticists or people who study genetic inheritance specifically to study how a trait, one specific trait, is passed on from one generation to another generation, and that is done by plotting pedigree chart. Now, using a pedigree chart and doing pedigree analysis, there are two things that we can get to know. That is the mode of inheritance of a trait, meaning that whether the trait is dominantly inherited or the trait is recessively inherited. So the mode of inheritance of a specific trait can be figured out. And the second thing that can be figured out is whether the trait is autosomal or allosomal, whether the trait is inherited through autosomes or allosomes or sex chromosomes. So we can figure out two things, whether it's a dominant or a recessive sort of inheritance, and whether it's an autosomal or allosomal sort of inheritance. Okay, so before we get into pedigree analysis, there are certain symbols that you would have to know to either plot a pedigree chart or to infer from a pedigree chart that is already plotted. So the symbols are these. If you have a empty circle, then that represents a female. If you have an empty square, that represents a male. If you have a filled in circle or a filled in square, it represents someone who is affected, meaning that this female or this male is affected by a disease. Okay, so if it is completely filled in, it means that they are affected. If it is filled in half, so if the female is filled in half or the male is filled in half, then that person becomes a carrier, and this is specifically for carriers who are autosomal traits. Okay, so if the circle is half filled, then it is a female who is a carrier, but for a autosome. Okay, not a sex-linked one, but an autosome. And if a square is filled in half, then this male is a carrier for a specific trait, and that trait is passed on the autosomes and not on the sex chromosomes. If there is a singular dot put into a circle, then that female is a carrier and for a allosome or a sex chromosome. Now why don't we have a male who is a carrier? Because a male is made up of one X and one Y chromosome. Now we know that if there is a gene present on the Y chromosome, then it is passed on from father to son and father to son. So this cannot become a carrier, because whenever the Y chromosome is there, because there is only one Y chromosome, that trait is always expressed. For example, hypertrichosis. It is a gene that is carried on the Y chromosome and passed on from father to son. So every single time that gene is present for hypertrichosis on the Y chromosome, that trait is expressed. So hypertrichosis is expressed. Because there is no extra Y chromosome, there is no dominant and recessive. So in case of the Y chromosome, that is already taken care of. So this does not come into account. So a Y chromosome cannot become a carrier. What about the X chromosome? If the X chromosome is carrying a specific trait, because the male has only one X chromosome, if the trait that is being carried, the causative agent for the disease, is a dominant one, let's say that it is a dominant one, then because there is only one X chromosome and because it's a dominant gene, it is always expressed. So the male cannot become a carrier. If the gene that is being carried is a recessive one, for example in hemophilia, it's a recessive trait. Because the X chromosome is only one in the male, even though the trait is recessive, it gets expressed because this person is carrying only one X chromosome because he's a male. So males cannot become carriers when it comes to allosomes. When it comes to sex chromosomes, males cannot become carriers. It's only females who become carriers because they have two X chromosomes. So if you take into example the same example that I gave for the male, like hemophilia, you have two X chromosomes in a female, and because hemophilia is a recessive trait, if only one X chromosome is carrying the recessive trait and the other one is not carrying the recessive trait but is having the dominant one, then this female becomes a carrier for hemophilia and is not going to have the disease. Okay, so only females can be carriers for allosomes, males cannot be. But if it is autosomes, both females and males can be carriers. Moving on, if there is a straight line being drawn between a female and a male, that represents mating. Okay, if there are two lines being drawn between a female and a male, that represents consanguous mating. Consanguous mating means that the female and the male are closely related. Okay, so they might be belonging to the same family or related family, so they are blood relations, and if these two are mating, then there is a double line drawn. But if it is a normal mating, as in the male and the female are not related by blood, then it's a single line, and that represents normal mating. If there is a perpendicular line drawn and then a horizontal line drawn again, that represents progeny. Progeny meaning the offsprings that will arise from the mating of that female and male. So this female and male are mating, and they are going to produce, let's say, 3 offsprings. So that is how the offsprings are represented. Okay, and then you will have how twins are represented. So you have a female and a male, a line drawn in between showing that it is mating. But if the progeny line is coming out from the same point, unlike the progeny line which comes out from one single point and then branches out. So this is normal progeny, but if the progeny line is coming from the same point, then it represents twins. Okay, now this kind of representation is for dizygotic twins, meaning that the twins are originating from 2 different zygotes. Okay, because they are originating from 2 different zygotes, these 2 twins can be both female, okay, because they are dizygotic, or they can be one female and one male because again they are dizygotic, or they can be both males. Okay, so this will be when it is a dizygotic twin. If there is a line being drawn in between the progeny, the twins, then they are monozygotic twins, meaning that the twins are originating from one single zygote which differentiated into two different zygotes during some stage of development. Okay, so these, if there is a line being drawn between the progeny, between the two twins, then they are monozygotic twins. And monozygotic twins can be of only two types: either both of them are female or both of them are male. They cannot be one male and one female because they are originating from only one zygote, and because of that reason they can have only one pair of sex chromosomes. They cannot have two different pairs of sex chromosomes. Okay? Okay. So now that you know the symbols, let's try and figure out what kind of inheritance is there in this random chart. It's a random pedigree chart. There is nothing written on it, and the only thing that you have are to go by symbols. Can we infer what kind of inheritance pattern is there from this chart? So first things first, if there are circles, it means that they are females. If there are squares, it means that they are males. If the circle is filled in like this one here, it's an affected female. If there are squares filled in like that one there, it's an affected male. So we need to figure out what kind of inheritance pattern is there in this pedigree analysis chart. So inheritance pattern, like I said, can be two types. It can be either dominant recessive inheritance pattern. So the trait is a dominant trait and is being passed on from generation to generation. That is one of the inheritance pattern. Or it can be recessive, meaning that the trait is a recessive trait and it is being passed on from generation to generation. Another, it can be either sex-linked or autosomal, meaning that either the dominant or the recessive trait is present on the sex chromosome, and because it's a recessive trait, it can only be present on the X chromosome. So sex-linked inheritance is usually confined to only the X chromosome. We don't talk about the Y chromosome at all when it is sex-linked inheritance. Or it can be autosomal inheritance, meaning that it can be either dominant or recessive and it is inherited through the autosomes and not the sex chromosomes. So we will go through each of these ones and try and figure out what kind of inheritance pattern this is. So let's figure out whether or not it's a dominant sort of a inheritance pattern. So let's start off with autosomes, for example. Okay, because this female here is affected, and let's say that it's an autosomal dominant recessive, autosomal dominant inheritance pattern. So the genotype of this female can either be a dominant gene and a recessive gene, because this is a dominant sort of an inheritance pattern, meaning that even if one gene or one allele of that gene is dominant, the trait is expressed. Because this female is expressing the trait, she can have either one dominant, one recessive allele, or she can have both of them being dominant, right? And we are talking about autosomes here. Alright, and the same goes for the male also. He can have one dominant, one recessive, or both of them being dominant. Okay, now we know that the male here is not affected and the female here is not affected, meaning that they need to have completely recessive traits. Correct? Right? They need to be double recessive because we are talking about the dominant autosome. So both of them need to be recessive, only then the person will not show a specific trait. If one is dominant, then the dominant trait will for sure be shown. Now how does the inheritance pattern go? You can see that none of the siblings, none of the progeny in both the cases are not having the trait. Okay, so none of the progeny have the trait, so all of them are not affected. Now this cannot happen when the at least one of the parent is carrying the dominant trait. It cannot happen because one of the chromosome is coming from the father for sure. So all of them will receive a recessive trait, correct? Because one is coming from the father and he is double recessive, so he can only give a recessive trait. Now the mother on the other hand is a dominant one. So at least one of the offsprings, if she is double dominant like here, then all of them will have the dominant trait. The same goes for the father here. If he is double dominant, then all of them will have the dominant trait. So all of them need to be affected, which is not the case. So it cannot be that they are double dominant. Alright, so we are taking this out. He cannot be and she cannot be double dominant. Let's assume that even if they are heterozygous dominant and say that the recessive trait came to one of the daughters, the other daughter also, let's say, had a recessive trait, at least one of the progeny needs to have the dominant trait passed on. Okay, same goes for the progeny here. If the recessive trait is being passed on to one offspring, the dominant trait needs to be passed on to another offspring, correct? So in this case, one of the progeny in this generation and one of the progeny at least in this generation should have been affected. But because they are not affected at all, it cannot be autosomal dominant. So autosomal dominant is not happening in this pedigree analysis. What is the next thing that we can go to? Can it be sex-linked dominant? Okay, so let's assume that the inheritance pattern here can be sex-linked dominant. If that is the case, like I was saying, sex-linked dominant we are only going to figure out with the X chromosome. The Y chromosome is not going to come into picture here. So if it is sex-linked dominant, then it needs to be correct. She can have one X chromosome that is having the dominant trait and the other one having the recessive trait, or she can have both the X chromosomes having the dominant trait. Now for the male on the other hand, because this is X-linked, he is going to have only one X chromosome which is dominant. Okay, now let's go to the inheritance pattern. The male here is not affected, so he is going to have a normal X chromosome with a Y. The female here is not affected, so she is going to have a normal X chromosome. Let's assume that she is not a carrier for this example. She can even be a carrier, but let's assume that she is not a carrier. Now, inheritance pattern. The females are going to get the X from the father, correct? And the male is going to get the Y from the father. The same here. The male is going to get the Y from the father and the female is going to get the X from the father. Now if the father is affected in this case and he has the dominant gene here, because the female has inherited here, irrespective of what kind of X chromosome from the female she is getting, from the mother she is getting, this female needs to be affected because this is a dominant gene that we are talking about. So even if one of the alleles is a dominant one and the other is recessive, this female needs to be affected, but she is not. So it is not sex-linked dominant. Okay. What other thing that we can talk about? Can it be sex-linked recessive? That is another option that is there. So if it is sex-linked recessive, it goes with the same pattern. If it is sex-linked recessive also, now here you have a female who is affected. So because she is sex-linked recessive, she can have the pattern of both recessive genes being present on both the X chromosomes, In case of the male, it's just one X chromosome that has the trait, the recessive trait that is there. Now this female here and the male here, the male can definitely not be a carrier, so that is ruled out. The female here can be a carrier, so we can take that she is a carrier because this is a recessive trait. She can be a carrier. Unless and until she is double recessive, she is not going to show the trait. So the expression of the trait will happen only if she is double recessive in case of sex-linked recessive traits. If she is a carrier, in which case she is having only one recessive trait and the other one is dominant, she can be a carrier, like for example in hemophilia, but she is not going to show the trait. The male here of course is carrying, and so he needs to be having the disease and has the recessive trait there. So again, the inheritance pattern, if you go through the same, from the males you are getting the Y, the X and the X here. Here you have the Y and the X which has the trait. Now from the female you are going to get one X chromosome with the trait, one X chromosome with the trait, one X chromosome with the trait, correct? Now in this case you can either get the carrier trait or you can get the normal X chromosome also. Assume that we are getting the normal X chromosome in both of these cases. Now what happens with this male here? Because the female is affected, it means that she is double recessive, meaning that one of the X chromosome which has the recessive trait is being passed on to the son, in which case this son should have been affected, correct? But he is not affected, meaning that this entire inheritance pattern cannot be sex-linked recessive. So sex-linked recessive is not the answer. So it's not autosomal dominant, it's not sex-linked dominant, it's not sex-linked recessive. So the only other option that is there is that it can be autosomal and recessive. Okay, so the only other option that is there is that the inheritance pattern can be autosomal and recessive. Let's figure out whether autosomal recessive inheritance pattern makes sense in this case. Okay, if it is autosomal recessive, because the female here is affected, it means that she has both the recessive traits. Male here is affected, both the recessive traits. Male here not affected, so he can either be a heterozygous condition, one dominant, one recessive, or homozygous condition wherein it's a double dominant. Same goes for the female here. She can be heterozygous dominant or homozygous dominant. Inheritance pattern from the female, let's start. We are going to get only the recessive trait because she has only recessive traits there. From the male here, we are only going to get recessive traits, correct? Now from the father, we can get either a dominant trait or a recessive trait in case of heterozygous, or we can get the dominant trait. Because none of them are affected, we are going to assume that it's the dominant trait that has been inherited. So dominant trait inherited all through. Now these two are mating, so the female here and the male here are mating, and we see that none of them are affected. So it can happen that the inheritance pattern for this, because it is autosomal, will be that they are all getting one of the Okay, so for the progeny here, because none of them are affected, we can assume that from the mother or from the father, because both of them are heterozygous, they can get either one dominant from the mother and one recessive from the father, or one dominant from the mother and one recessive from the father. So it can go both ways. So one dominant from the father and one recessive from the mother, or one recessive from the father and one dominant from the mother. In any case, all of them are going to have a heterozygous genotype. And because this is autosomal recessive, only if one recessive allele is present, the individual is not going to be affected. Only when two recessive alleles are present, the individual is going to be affected. So just by looking at the chart, we can figure out that the inheritance pattern for this pedigree analysis is autosomal and recessive. So it is autosomal and it is recessive. As an example, solve one of the pedigree charts that I did before. You realize that it's a time consuming process, because you need to go through each and every option that is there. You need to go through whether or not it is dominant or recessive. You need to go through whether or not it is autosomal or sex-linked. So you will have 4 different options to go through, and you will be solving each time the pedigree chart is solved from that perspective. So first you will start off thinking that it's autosomal dominant, solve it, see it is not. Then you go through sex-linked dominant, see it is not. Sex-linked recessive, see it is not. Autosomal recessive, yes, that is the answer. But it's a time consuming process. So instead of doing that, there are some tips or tricks that you can use to figure out a chart at one glance. Not that these are ultimate things, that just because a chart has one of these rules, it means that it is that sort of a dominance. You will have to recheck it against others. But these are tips and tricks to figure out at a glance, so that it will kind of shorten your list of possibilities of the different kinds of inheritance patterns that are there. So for autosomal dominant, the one trick to remember is that it will never skip a generation. Because it is an autosomal dominant gene, even if one single allele is dominant in the offspring, that person is going to have the trait, correct? Because it's a dominant allele. It's a dominant inheritance pattern. It's a dominant allele, so as long as there is even one dominant allele, the person is going to have the trait. And so if it is autosomal dominant, then there is no skipping of generation. If the parents are affected, the F1 generation is affected, the F2 generation is affected, F3 generation is affected. Irrespective of how many generations you go through, all of the offsprings are always affected. Meaning that not all offsprings will be affected. It's just that at least one of the offsprings will have the trait being shown in them. That is autosomal dominant. Another thing to remember in autosomal dominant is that you can have affected parents and unaffected children. Meaning that if a parent is going to have, let's say, 4 offsprings, because it does not skip a generation, at least one of the offspring is going to be affected, but the other 3 will not be affected. So that can happen, that you can have both the parents being affected and the children not being affected. It is because both the parents may be heterozygous, in which case some of the children may get both the recessive alleles from both the parents. So if both the male and the female are heterozygous, in this case, okay, there will be offspring who will be double dominant, correct? And there can be an offspring who is heterozygous dominant, but you will also have an offspring who is double recessive. So this offspring is not going to be affected. So you can have affected parents here and an unaffected child, okay? So this can happen in case of the autosomal dominant type of inheritance pattern. Now the next one, the autosomal recessive. It can skip a generation, meaning that you can have affected parents and then unaffected children. Okay, so it can skip a generation, meaning that you will have affected parents, like the example that we saw just now, that in the chart the mother was affected, the father was not affected, but all of the children were not affected. So it can skip a generation, but it will reappear in the next generation. That is how autosomal recessive works. It is always going to reappear in some generation later on, but it can skip a generation. Also, you will have unaffected parents and affected children. So you can have unaffected parents, because this is skipping a generation, you can have unaffected parents and then affected children. Okay, with X-linked dominant and X-linked recessive, with both of them, the one thing that you will need to remember, or the easiest way to figure out if it is sex-linked other than autosomal, is that it never transfers from the father to the son. Okay, if a trait is X-linked or sex-linked, it will never transfer from the father to the son. So if you have an affected father, okay, so you have an affected father who is meeting with an unaffected mother, let's say, and then you have an offspring where the son is also affected, this is a clear indicator that this kind of inheritance pattern is definitely autosomal and not sex-linked. Why? Because the gene is always carried on the X chromosome. So if you have a father who is affected, and because the gene is carried on the X chromosome, this X chromosome is being passed on to the daughter. Okay? The son will always get the Y chromosome, and the Y chromosome is not carrying any genes in case of sex-linked dominant or sex-linked recessive. The Y chromosome is not carrying any of the genes. So in this case, if the disease is being passed on from father to son, then it can neither be X-linked dominant or X-linked recessive. This is a clear-cut tip that I can give. Unless it's a Y-linked inheritance pattern, then it passes from the father to the son. A Y-linked inheritance pattern can be something like hypertrichosis, in which case the gene is carried on the Y chromosome. Correct? Hypertrichosis is a Y-linked inheritance pattern and the gene is carried on the Y chromosome. And if you have the father being affected and the son being affected, you can think of it as either autosomal inheritance, or it can be a Y-linked inheritance pattern like hypertrichosis. Okay, so like I was saying before, these rules are just sort of a rule that you can use generally. So they're not specific rules. You cannot push out every other type of inheritance pattern just because you see one of the rules being true. You will need to check it again. Like I was saying, if the inheritance pattern is from father to son, sure, you can say that it's neither X-linked dominant or X-linked recessive. That is true. So the inheritance pattern can be autosomal, which is the major type of inheritance pattern that is there, but in the rare case that they are asking for a Y-linked inheritance pattern, so in the answers if you figure out that there is hypertrichosis written, then you can also think of whether or not it's a Y-linked inheritance pattern, because that gets passed on from father to son. Using the tips that I gave you just before, we will try to solve this pedigree chart, and let's make it shorter than I did before. So you have this pedigree chart here. You have a father who is affected, then you have 3 offsprings, one female who is affected, one male who is not affected, and another male who is affected. Both of them are going to mate with a male and a female who are not affected. Then you have progeny who are completely not affected, mating with a male who is not affected again, and then you have affected children coming out here. So can this be a dominant or a recessive sort of inheritance is what we are going to figure out first off. Now, you have affected in parent generation. So let's say this is the parent generation, then this is the F1 generation, this here is the F2 generation, and here you have the F3 generation, correct? Now, you have one affected person in the parent generation, you have two affected people in the F1 generation, nobody affected in the F2 generation, then you have affected people in the F1 generation. So, this kind of inheritance cannot be dominant because one generation does not have anybody affected. So, the consensus can be that this is a recessive sort of a inheritance. Now, can it be autosomal or sex-linked? So, can it be a sex-linked inheritance pattern? A clear example would be that here you have the father, a male who is affected, and then you have the son who is affected in the F1 generation. If it was sex-linked and recessive, because we know that it is not dominant, if it was sex-linked and recessive, then it cannot pass from the father to the son, and therefore it is not a sex-linked inheritance for sure. So the only other option that we have here is whether or not it's an autosomal recessive type of inheritance. Is it true? So that is what we are going to figure out. Now, because this person is affected, he has a double recessive gene, affected, double recessive, affected, so double recessive again, both of them affected, double recessive. Right? Writing down the genotypes for the double recessive is pretty easy, because if it is autosomal recessive, then whoever is affected needs to have a double recessive kind of genotype. Now we start off with the mother in the parental generation. She, because this is a recessive pattern, she can have either a heterozygous genotype or she can have a homozygous genotype. Correct? She can be homozygous dominant or heterozygous dominant, and both these cases will ensure that she is not going to show the trait, which she is not showing in this case. Now let's go to the inheritance pattern. We know that all of them are double recessive, correct? Because they are showing the trait, they need to be double recessive. So let's start off with the inheritance pattern, taking the father into consideration. Because he is double recessive, he can only provide a recessive trait. So from the father, all of them are getting one recessive trait. Now, if the mother is double dominant, homozygous dominant, then the only allele that she can provide will be a dominant one. So she can provide only a dominant allele, which explains why this person is not affected, but it does not explain why these two offsprings are affected. So this mother here needs to have a heterozygous genotype like this and not a homozygous genotype, because for one son she can give the dominant A allele, and for the other two children she is giving the recessive allele, and because of that reason they are getting affected. So here you have a recessive allele, here you have a recessive allele coming from the mother, and here you have a dominant allele coming from the father. Now same thing, carry on. You have all of these individuals not affected, so they can be again heterozygous, right? Now how does the inheritance pattern go in this case? Now because this male is affected, the only allele that you are going to get is a recessive one, but because these two males are not affected, the only allele that can come would be the dominant one. So like the example of the mother that I gave here, this female here cannot be double dominant. She needs to be heterozygous dominant because she is providing the dominant allele for both of the sons. Now going back here, imagining that this female here has a heterozygous allele. She cannot have homozygous. If she was homozygous recessive, then she would be affected. Now here the male cannot again be homozygous recessive because then he would be affected. He can have a heterozygous dominant allele, wherein one allele is dominant and the other is recessive. Now this can go both ways, meaning that he can have a dominant allele and a recessive allele, or he can have both of them dominant. Okay, and the same goes here, that this female can have one dominant and one recessive, or she can have both of them dominant. But we see that both of the children here are affected, which means that they are getting both the alleles as recessive, which means that both of them need to be heterozygous, so they cannot be homozygous at all. So the recessive allele from the father, the recessive allele from the mother, affected. Recessive allele from the father, recessive allele from the mother, affected. Okay, so going back to the tricks and tips I told you, the inheritance pattern is there in the parent F1 but not there in the F2, so it cannot be dominant. It is skipping a generation, so it cannot be dominant. But if you go back to the recessive, autosomal recessive, it is skipping a generation. So you can have parents who are affected, offspring who are affected again, and then these offsprings who are affected, and then a generation which is not affected. So you have somebody affected here but not affected here. So it is skipping a generation, so it can be autosomal recessive. Sex linked, because it is passing from the father to the son, it cannot be. It cannot be sex linked dominant, it cannot be sex linked recessive, because the passage is happening from the father to the son. Okay. Now you can also question whether or not the passing is happening through the Y chromosome, and that's why the father to son passing is happening. If that's the case, then why is the female affected? So if the female is affected, which in this case is, it cannot even be a Y-linked inheritance pattern. So that explains all the tricks and tips I already talked to you about. So there can be another type of problem solving wherein they give you the question and ask you to plot the pedigree. So before we were solving problems where the pedigree was plotted and we were trying to figure out what kind of inheritance pattern it is. Now we are being given the kind of inheritance pattern it is, we need to plot the pedigree. So how do we go about doing it? Now first things first, the question reads, a woman who has a father who was hemophilic marries a normal man. They have 3 children, 2 males and 1 female, and they are asking us to plot the pedigree and also maybe to figure out the genotype, the probable genotype of all of the individuals who are involved. So first things first, it says that it is a hemophilic person. Now we know that hemophilia is X-linked inheritance pattern, and that so it's an X-linked inheritance pattern, and it is a recessive inheritance pattern, which means that males are more affected than females. Females can be carriers, and both the X chromosomes need to have the recessive trait for a female to be affected. So these 3 things keep in mind because it's a hemophilic person. Now the question reads, a woman who has a father. So let's start off with a woman. Okay, she has a father. Now the father is hemophilic, so he is affected. We don't know anything about the mother because that is not said, and this female is going to marry a normal man who is not affected, and they have 3 children. So 3 children, 2 of them are female and 1 is a male. So 2 females and 1 male, and it doesn't say whether or not the offsprings are affected. So we are going to figure out what will be the probable genotype of all of the people who are involved. We have already drawn the pedigree chart. Now we need to figure out what will be the probable genotype of each and every one of them. Now because this male here is affected, we already know that he is carrying the gene for hemophilia. Now because it's a daughter who is involved and he is passing the X chromosome, so at least one of the X chromosomes has the recessive gene which is passed on to the daughter, because it's a sex-linked inheritance. This female here can have 2 normal X chromosomes because she is not affected, or she can be a carrier. So she can be a carrier, meaning that she has 1 chromosome, which is one of the X chromosomes which is carrying the recessive trait. It does not say whether or not the woman is affected. So it says a woman whose father was hemophilic marries a normal man, they have 3 children. So it does not say whether or not the woman is affected. So it can happen that she is affected because she is getting the recessive trait from her mother, or she cannot be affected because she is getting a normal trait from her mother. Now this male here is for sure normal, we know that, because it says that the woman is marrying a normal man, so he is not carrying any recessive trait on him. Now the inheritance pattern, he is going to provide the Y chromosome to this child and the X chromosomes to these 2 children here. Okay. Now if we consider that this female is a carrier, these 2 females can become carriers, in which case this male here will be affected, or they can have this X chromosome being passed on to the male, in which case again starting from the male you have the Y chromosome from the male, the normal X chromosome from the male, the normal X chromosome from the male. Now from the female, if you are getting the normal X chromosome, then this female, the offspring here, is not affected of course, and is not a carrier also. This female again will be not affected, not a carrier, and this male here will not be affected also. So these are the probable genotypes that you can have for all of these individuals in the pedigree chart, and also this is how you start plotting a pedigree.